In 1998 in Cambridge, the company that had placed a computer into nearly every British school was quietly broken apart. Acorn Computers was dead. A decade earlier, the Acorn brand had defined a generation of British education. Through the BBC Micro and the Acorn Archimedes, it had commanded the school ICT room. But by the late 1990s, the battle was lost. The global market had chosen the standard IBM-compatible PC. Microsoft Windows had won. The Acorn hardware division was shut down, its desktop machines were discontinued, and the brand was absorbed into other corporate entities. For the teachers who had relied on the platforms, the pupils who had learned to code on their distinct keyboards, and the local developers who had built boxed software for a uniquely British ecosystem, it felt like the definitive end of a public service promise. The Acorn badge became a legacy system, relegated to loft storage, charity shop shelves, and eventually museum cases. But the paradox of Acorn Computers is that its death was a physical illusion. The desktop machines failed on the open market, yet the processor architecture inside them survived. Desperate to save their struggling computers a decade earlier, Acorn's engineers had accidentally designed a chip so remarkably power efficient that it would outlive the company that desperately needed it. The story of Acorn is not merely the story of how a British classroom computing empire collapsed under the weight of global standards. It is the story of how a failed desktop machine quietly became the blueprint for the ARM processor, the architecture that now powers almost every smartphone on Earth. Every week, we tell the stories of British machines, platforms, software houses, and screens that once taught the country what the future felt like and what happened when the market moved on. Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story begins not with nostalgia, but with a specific place, in Cambridge in 1978. The story begins not with nostalgia, but with a specific place, in Cambridge in 1978. At the time, computing in Britain was largely an industrial corporate affair. Mainframes, massive room-sized computers used by universities, government departments, and large businesses to process vast amounts of data, dominated the landscape. The idea of a computer sitting on a family living room table or a school desk was a distant, almost science fiction concept. But in a small office at 4A Market Hill, two men, Herman Hauser and Chris Curry, founded a company called Cambridge Processor Unit, soon to be renamed Acorn Computers. Their early machines, like the Acorn System 1, were bare circuit boards aimed at engineers, scientists, and dedicated hobbyists. They were machines to be wired, soldered, and programmed in hexadecimal code, not unboxed and plugged into a household television. However, the British landscape was about to change. By the turn of the decade, the British government and public institutions recognized a looming crisis. Britain, the nation that had helped invent early computing, was terrified of being left behind in the new digital age by American software and Japanese manufacturing. In 1981, responding to this national anxiety, the BBC launched the Computer Literacy Project. It was a highly ambitious public service broadcast initiative designed to teach the entire country how to understand and program microcomputers. But a television program, a broadcast sent to millions of living rooms, needed a standard physical machine. The BBC required a computer that could sit in classrooms, withstand the heavy, uncoordinated hands of pupils, and connect directly to a standard television set or monitor. It had to feature a robust keyboard, expandable memory, and standard connections for scientific equipment. The contract to build this machine would effectively define British computing for a decade. Acorn's fierce rival, Clive Sinclair, was already building cheaper machines, attempting to win the mass market on price alone. But Acorn chose a different path. They did not want to build the cheapest computer in Britain. They wanted to build the most capable, reliable, and expandable one. The deadline to show a working prototype to the BBC was impossibly tight. In exactly 1 week, Acorn engineers, led by Steve Ferber and Sophie Wilson, designed and built a machine initially called the Proton. They worked through the night, wiring components by hand, praying the circuits would not short out during the critical demonstration. When the BBC executives arrived in Cambridge, the prototype was switched on. It worked. Acorn won the contract, securing a public service endorsement that no amount of private advertising could buy. In late 1981, this machine was released to the British public and educational authorities as the BBC microcomputer. It was a heavy, serious piece of hardware, housed in a robust, wedge-shaped beige plastic case. It was not a cheap toy. The entry-level Model A cost $235, while the much more capable Model B, the version that would become the absolute standard across the country, was priced at $335. A home computer, a machine sold for individual use, connected to a screen and loaded with software, had finally become a trusted institutional object. The physical details of the BBC Micro dictated the British classroom experience. Unlike the cheap, rubbery membrane keyboards of its market competitors, it featured a proper, mechanical typewriter-style keyboard adorned with bright red function keys. When switched on, it emitted a loud, distinctive, sharp double beep that would soon echo down the corridors of almost every primary and secondary school in the country. Software was initially loaded via cassette tape, magnetic tape normally used for audio, repurposed to feed code into the machine's memory through sound. In a British classroom, it took minutes of agonizing, screeching noises playing from a heavy desktop tape recorder for a single educational program to appear on the screen. But the true genius of the BBC Micro was its connectivity. At the back of the beige case, Acorn had included an array of connection ports. There was an analog port, a user port, and a special interface called the tube. This meant the BBC Micro was not locked in isolation. In a school science lab, a pupil could connect the machine to a thermometer to measure temperature changes on screen, or wire it to a rudimentary robotic arm. It turned the computer from a simple calculator into a control center for the physical world. Furthermore, it ran BBC Basic, a highly structured, fast, and accessible version of the BASIC programming language, allowing bedroom coders and pupils alike to write complex games and educational tools. The BBC Micro was not merely a piece of hardware, it was an entire ecosystem. When a school bought one, they were buying into a system of BBC television programs, local education authority budgets, classroom lesson plans, magazine tutorials, and dedicated school computer clubs. Teachers who had never written a line of code were suddenly wheeling the heavy machine into classrooms on metal trolleys. Pupils gathered around the glowing cathode ray tube monitor, a heavy glass screen used before modern flat panels existed, taking turns to type in commands. The machine dominated the educational market, capturing an estimated 80% of UK schools. It successfully taught a generation how to control a machine, proving that Britain could build its own digital ecosystem without relying entirely on American imports. It built a culture of software houses, bedroom coders, and high-street computer magazines that fed off the machine's success. The BBC Micro was an 8-bit machine. Its main processor, the central chip which performs calculations and executes instructions, was incredibly fast for its time, but it had a hard ceiling. It could only address a limited amount of memory, and as software became more complex, graphics more detailed, and user demands more intense, the processor began to choke. Acorn knew that to survive the coming decade, they needed a machine that could process data in larger, 16-bit or 32-bit chunks. They searched the global market for a new processor to power their next generation of computers, evaluating chips from American giants like Motorola and National Semiconductor. But every chip they tested was too slow, too complex, or too poorly designed for the lightning-fast response times Acorn demanded for their desktop machines. The Cambridge engineers realized that if they wanted to build the next era of British computing, they could not simply buy the brain of the machine off a shelf. They would have to invent it themselves. By 1983, the BBC Micro had conquered the British classroom, but the engineers at Acorn Computers knew a dangerous ceiling was rapidly approaching. The machine was powered by the 6502, an 8-bit processor. It was reliable and well understood, but it could only process small chunks of data at a time and could only access a severely limited amount of memory. As educational software became more ambitious, requiring better graphics and complex calculations, the 6502 began to choke. Acorn needed to build a successor, a machine that could process data in 16-bit or 32-bit chunks, a processor architecture capable of handling vastly more information at once, allowing for high-resolution color screens, fast multitasking, and complex physics that older machines simply could not attempt. The natural step was to buy a more powerful processor from the American giants who dominated silicon manufacturing. Acorn's engineering team, led by Steve Ferber and Sophie Wilson, tested the latest chips from Intel, Motorola, and National Semiconductor. But every chip they tested failed Acorn's specific requirements. The American processors were becoming incredibly complex, packed with hundreds of different instructions. Because they were doing so much, they were slow to respond to hardware interrupts, the vital signals that told a computer to stop what it was doing and pay attention to a user's keystroke, a disk drive, or a piece of connected scientific equipment. Acorn's machines were built for schools and laboratories. They needed lightning-fast response times. Faced with a global supply chain that could not provide the right brain for their next machine, the Cambridge engineers made a decision that bordered on commercial insanity. They decided that a small British company, with a fraction of the research budget of IBM or Intel, would design its own 32-bit processor from scratch. Their breakthrough came from studying academic papers from universities in the United States regarding a new concept called RISC. RISC, reduced instruction, set computer, was a processor design philosophy that stripped away complex, rarely used commands, leaving only a small set of simple instructions that the chip could execute at blistering speed. Instead of building a heavy, complicated brain, Acorn would build a lean, highly efficient one. Sophie Wilson began designing the instruction set for this new processor, incredibly, by writing the simulation in BBC Basic on a standard BBC Micro. Steve Ferber worked on the hardware architecture. They called their project the Acorn RISC Machine, or ARM. When the design was finished, they partnered with an American manufacturer, VLSI Technology, to actually fabricate the silicon. In April 1985, the first batch of ARM1 chips arrived back at the Cambridge office. In the semiconductor industry, it was almost unheard of for a completely new processor design to work perfectly on the first attempt. But when the Acorn engineers plugged the ARM1 into a circuit board and powered it on, it simply worked. When they typed a command, the screen flashed with the prompt immediately. Then they noticed a physical anomaly that would eventually dictate the future of global technology. The processor was not getting hot. Most modern chips required large ceramic packages or metal heat sinks, physical cooling blocks attached to the processor, to prevent them from melting under the strain of electrical resistance. The ARM1 was drawing so little power that it barely generated any heat. It ran cold. At the time, Acorn's engineers simply viewed this as a convenient side effect of their elegant, simplified RISC design. They were building desktop computers that plugged into the wall. Power efficiency was a bonus, not the primary goal. They had no idea that they had just solved the fundamental battery life problem for mobile devices that did not yet exist. With the ARM processor proven, Acorn built a new flagship computer around it. The Acorn Archimedes launched in 1987. The physical machine was a stark departure from the heavy, wedge-shaped BBC Micro. The Archimedes looked like a serious, modern workstation. It came in a large, flat, beige desktop unit with a separate mechanical keyboard and a distinctive 3-button mouse. Inside the motherboard, the main circuit board that connects all the computer's components together, was incredibly sparse. Because the ARM chip was so efficient, the machine required fewer supporting components, making it cheaper to manufacture while delivering terrifying speed. At its launch, the Archimedes was widely considered to be the fastest desktop microcomputer in the world. To control this hardware, Acorn eventually developed RISC OS, a graphical operating system that managed the machine's resources and provided users with a fast, mouse-driven interface. Long before Microsoft Windows became a standard in British homes, RISC OS gave Archimedes users a smooth, windowed environment featuring a taskbar, draggable files, and instant responsiveness that made contemporary IBM-compatible PCs feel sluggish and primitive. The machine was an engineering triumph, but to survive, it needed an ecosystem. It needed developers, schools, and high-street validation. When the British computer magazines like Acorn User and Micro User received their review units, the press was astounded by the machine's raw capability. The benchmark for this power was a game called Zark, written by former bedroom coder David Braben. Unlike the flat, two-dimensional sprites of the ZX Spectrum or Commodore 64, Zark threw the player into a fluid, fast-moving, three-dimensional landscape rendered in vivid color. In a British bedroom or computer fair, seeing an Archimedes running Zark was a physical shock. It proved that British hardware could outpace the world. Acorn aggressively targeted the Archimedes at the local education authorities. At nearly $900 for a basic system, it was far too expensive for the average high street shopper at Dixon's or Curry's. But for a school ICT room, it was positioned as the ultimate investment in the future. Software houses like Computer Concepts began building powerful desktop publishing tools and entirely new applications, such as the music notation software Sibelius, were born on the Archimedes platform precisely because the ARM processor was the only chip fast enough to handle the complex rendering of musical scores in real time. The machine was a technical masterpiece, and the Archimedes was about to claim its throne as the absolute peak of British educational computing. But the very architecture that made the desktop machine so brilliant was secretly laying the groundwork for a completely different kind of empire. By the late 1980s and into the early 1990s, the Acorn Archimedes, powered by the radically efficient ARM processor, reached its absolute peak within the British educational system. The machine had successfully bridged the gap between the 8-bit era of the BBC Micro and the new 32-bit horizon. For a fleeting window of time, the fastest and most elegant desktop computers in the world were not sitting on the desks of Silicon Valley executives. They were sitting on scratched wooden tables in British comprehensive schools. In 1989, Acorn launched the Archimedes A3000. It was a physical return to the all-in-one wedge shape of the BBC Micro, designed specifically to survive the hostile environment of a school computer room. It featured a built-in floppy disk drive, a slot for removable magnetic storage disks that held pupil coursework and games, and a mechanical keyboard that clattered under the weight of heavy, uncoordinated typing. When a pupil switched on an A3000, it did not force them to stare at a blinking text prompt while a hard drive slowly spun up. The machine booted almost instantly. This was because RISC OS, the operating system, was stored entirely on ROM. Read-only memory chips that permanently held the core software. Within seconds, the screen displayed the desktop, complete with a taskbar at the bottom called the icon bar. Applications could be launched by simply clicking on beautiful, carefully designed pixel icons. Compared to the harsh, text-heavy MS-DOS environment that dominated American IBM-compatible PCs at the time, the Acorn Archimedes felt like it had been sent back from a more civilized future. This technical superiority created a fiercely protected ecosystem. Local education authorities across the UK, from Scottish councils to London boroughs, poured their purchasing budgets into Acorn hardware. The machine became the undisputed king of the school ICT room, the dedicated information and communication technology classroom that was rapidly becoming a standard feature of British secondary schools. The software that populated these machines was uniquely British, built by local developers who understood the school market. Software houses like Shurston Software and Formation built interactive educational tools that captivated pupils. A classroom could load up a historical simulation, explore the human body, or use vector graphics tools like Acorn Draw. A program so mathematically precise and fast that it rivaled professional design software, costing thousands of pounds. There were music rooms running Sibelius, science labs using data logging software, and primary schools where the Archimedes was mounted on a wheeled metal trolley, moved from room to room as a shared, highly prized resource. In a British comprehensive school where one Acorn Archimedes might serve an entire classroom of pupils, the right machine did not merely run software. It decided who first saw code move on a screen, who discovered games as systems, who imagined work beyond the high street, and who felt that the future had finally entered the classroom. For the pupils who used them, the Acorn Archimedes built an expectation of what a computer should be: instantly responsive, deeply creative, and completely immune to the crashes and sluggishness of the emerging Windows PCs. The Acorn ecosystem extended beyond the school gates too. Computer magazines like Risk User and Archive filled the shelves of W. H. Smith and John Menzies. At local computer fairs, held in university halls and leisure centers across the country, enthusiasts gathered to buy software on floppy disks, swap programming tips, and marvel at the sheer processing power of the ARM architecture. For a brief, glorious period, Acorn had achieved the impossible. They had built their own hardware, written their own operating system, designed their own world-class silicon brain, and captured a massive, dedicated user base. They had proven that British engineering could create a completely independent, technologically superior platform. The brand had found its perfect audience, but the market had not yet shown the price of fighting a global war. By the early 1990s, the Acorn ecosystem was a vibrant, self-sustaining world. If you were a British pupil, your coursework was frequently printed from an Archimedes. If you were a teacher, your lesson plans and student records were stored on Acorn-formatted floppy disks. The magazine shelves at W. H. Smith and John Menzies were heavy with dedicated publications like Acorn User, Acorn Computing, and Risk User. Their thick pages were packed with mail-order adverts selling memory upgrades, custom monitors, and specialist educational software. At weekend computer fairs held in leisure centers and exhibition halls across the country, thousands of British users gathered to buy boxed software, swap hardware tips, and celebrate a platform that felt inherently superior to the generic, clunky PCs appearing in corporate offices. Acorn even launched the A4, a laptop version of the Archimedes, bringing the immense power of the ARM processor into a portable clamshell design for traveling professionals. But Acorn's leadership knew that building hardware exclusively for British schools and a niche base of home enthusiasts was a fundamentally limited business. They had created the most efficient processor on Earth, yet it was trapped inside beige desktop cases in regional classrooms. The ARM architecture, the instruction set that allowed the chip to run fast while remaining physically cold, was too valuable to remain locked inside a single British computer brand. The pivotal moment occurred in 1990. Across the Atlantic, Apple Computer was secretly developing a new kind of mobile device, a PDA, a personal digital assistant, a handheld computer used for calendars, notes, and portable software before smartphones existed, required a processor that was powerful enough to recognize handwriting, but efficient enough to run on standard AA batteries without melting the plastic casing. Apple tested the standard American chips from AT&T and Motorola. They were all too power-hungry. Then they found Acorn. Apple realized that the obscure British company that built classroom computers had accidentally solved the portable power problem. But Apple did not want to buy processors from a rival computer manufacturer. To get the chip into their upcoming Apple Newton device, they demanded that the ARM design team be spun out into a separate, independent entity. In November 1990, Acorn, Apple, and the chip manufacturer VLSI Technology formed a new joint venture. It was called Advanced Risk Machines Ltd., or simply ARM. Acorn provided the engineers, the intellectual property, and the processor designs. Apple provided $1.5 million in funding. The original Cambridge architects moved out of Acorn's headquarters and into a converted barn in the nearby Cambridgeshire village of Swaffham Bolbec. At the time, this felt like a massive strategic victory. Acorn's internal engineering project had attracted the attention and investment of an American technology giant. The desktop computer business was still generating reliable revenue from the local education authorities, and now Acorn owned a nearly 50% stake in a promising semiconductor spin-off. Empowered by this, the Acorn hardware line continued to evolve. In 1994, Acorn released its most ambitious machine yet, the RISC PC. It was a modular, deeply impressive desktop computer that allowed users to stack plastic slices on top of each other to seamlessly add CD-ROM drives, optical discs that held vastly more software and multimedia than floppy disks, or additional hard drives. Uniquely, the RISC PC could even house a second Intel-compatible processor alongside its primary ARM chip. This architectural trick allowed the machine to run British educational software on RISC OS and American Microsoft Windows applications at the very same time. It was a brilliant feat of engineering designed to offer British schools the best of both worlds. The tech press praised it. Schools continued to upgrade their ICT rooms with it. The Acorn brand still felt permanent. When a pupil sat down in a school computer room in the mid-1990s and clicked on the RISC OS icon bar, they were still experiencing a distinctly British vision of computing, fast, elegant, and seemingly immune to the standardization that was sweeping the rest of the world. Acorn had successfully navigated the dangerous transition from 8-bit to 32-bit. They had held on to the classroom. They had spun out a silicon architecture that was beginning to attract global interest. To the casual observer walking past a high-street computer shop, the empire looked entirely secure. But the joint venture that felt like a triumph was actually a separation. The processor had been given a life of its own, meaning it no longer needed Acorn's desktop computers to survive. And outside the protected walls of the British school system, a global standard was preparing to crush the hardware that had been left behind. The first crack in the Acorn empire was not a dramatic bankruptcy or a sudden technological failure. It was almost invisible. It happened in the early 1990s, in the quiet meetings of local education authorities and school staff rooms across Britain. A school purchasing manager, holding a limited ICT budget, would look at a catalog. On one page was the Acorn Archimedes, or the newer RISC PC, a brilliant, elegant, uniquely British machine. On the opposite page was an IBM-compatible PC, a generic, beige, heavy box running Microsoft Windows. The Acorn machine was faster, it booted instantly from ROM, and its operating system was far more stable. But the generic PC was cheaper, and more importantly, it was what the rest of the world was buying. Parents began to complain at parents' evenings. They argued that while the Acorn was a wonderful tool for learning programming, the real world outside the school gates ran on American standards. If a pupil was going to get a job in a modern office, they needed to know how to use Microsoft Word, not an Acorn desktop publisher. The classroom, which for a decade had been a protected space for British computing, was suddenly being viewed as a training room for the corporate high street. Schools quietly changed their purchasing decisions. A comprehensive school that had exclusively bought Acorn hardware for 10 years would suddenly order a batch of standard PCs. This was the brutal reality of Force 4. Global scale, American standards, and convenience displacement. The British machine did not fail because it was poorly engineered. It failed because technical superiority could not defeat a global standard. Microsoft Windows and Intel processors, the Wintel monopoly, did not need to be elegant. They only needed to be everywhere. Once the schools began to migrate, the entire British ecosystem that Acorn had built began to fracture. This was Force 3, standards, ecosystems, and developer support, working in reverse. A platform needs users to attract software, and it needs software to keep users. As British classrooms filled with Windows PCs, the local software houses that had spent years writing dedicated educational programs for RISC OS faced a stark commercial choice. They could sell a few thousand copies to the shrinking Acorn market, or they could write for Windows and access millions of machines globally. The developers followed the larger market. The educational software catalog began to thin out. High-street computer magazines dedicated to Acorn, which had once been thick with mail-order adverts and community news, began to shrink in page count. The ecosystem was starving. Acorn's leadership recognized the danger, but their responses only highlighted the trap they were in. The brilliant RISC PC, launched in 1994, featured a secondary processor slot specifically so users could install an Intel-compatible chip alongside the ARM processor. This allowed the machine to run Microsoft Windows in a window on the RISC OS desktop. It was a staggering technical achievement, but strategically, it was an admission of defeat. By building a machine that could run American software, Acorn was admitting that their own British ecosystem was no longer enough. They were training their remaining users to transition to the competitor's platform. The launch of Microsoft Windows 95 accelerated the collapse. Windows 95 brought a user-friendly, mouse-driven graphical interface to the masses, erasing the main usability advantage that RISC OS had held for years. Suddenly, the IBM-compatible PC was not just a corporate spreadsheet machine. It was a multimedia home computer, High street chains like Dixon's, PC World, and Comet filled their windows with beige Windows machines. Acorn, lacking the massive marketing budgets of the American giants, was pushed off the retail shelf entirely. While the desktop computer division was slowly suffocating, a strange paradox was unfolding in a converted barn in Cambridgeshire. Advanced RISC Machines, the spin-off company created to develop Acorn's silicon architecture, was quietly building the future. Apple's Newton PDA, the device that had originally prompted the spin-off, was a commercial failure. But the ARM processor inside it had proven a fundamental point. The architecture was incredibly power efficient. In 1993, a rapidly growing mobile phone company called Nokia was looking for a processor for their next generation of digital handsets. Mobile phones were becoming smaller, but they needed to process complex digital radio signals without draining the battery in an hour. Nokia chose the ARM architecture. Soon, millions of mobile phones were shipping with the descendant of the exact same chip that had been designed to power a British classroom computer. The Acorn brand was splitting into two completely different realities. The machine on the desk was dying, but the processor they had invented was about to find a completely different kind of scale. By the late 1990s, the Acorn desktop computer was effectively exiled from the British high street. The battle for the home and the corporate office was over, comprehensively won by the IBM-compatible PC. Acorn's survival now depended entirely on a shrinking fraction of the educational market and a fiercely loyal but dwindling community of home enthusiasts. But Acorn's engineering team refused to surrender their hardware ambitions without one final attempt. They began developing a completely new desktop machine, codenamed Phoebe, which was intended to be released as the RISC PC-2. It was designed to bring modern processing speed, advanced graphics, and expansion capabilities back to the Acorn platform. Physically, it was a striking departure from the serious beige boxes of the past. The Phoebe was housed in a massive bright yellow tower case, designed to stand out under a desk or in an ICT room. The remaining British Acorn magazines hyped the machine. Loyal users placed pre-orders. But behind the scenes, Force One, hardware, supply chains, and manufacturing costs, was tearing the company apart. Building a custom desktop computer requires immense economies of scale. Because Acorn was only selling to a tiny localized UK market, the cost of manufacturing the Phoebe was unsustainably high. They could not compete with the massive global supply chains of companies like Dell or Compaq, who were churning out cheap Windows PCs by the millions. Even if the Phoebe was technically brilliant, the ecosystem around it was dead. Major software houses had abandoned RISC OS. There were no new blockbuster games, no essential corporate applications, and no reason for a high street shop to dedicate shelf space to a yellow tower that ran a minority operating system. Then came the financial paradox that ultimately killed the company. By 1998, Acorn's business structure had become an absurdity. The computer hardware division was bleeding money, struggling to survive on falling school sales. However, Acorn still owned a 43% stake in ARM, the processor company they had spun out a decade earlier. ARM had just been floated on the stock market, and its valuation was exploding. Mobile phone manufacturers globally were adopting the ARM architecture because of its unmatched power efficiency. Acorn, the company that had built the computers, was suddenly worth vastly less than the chips it had accidentally invented. In the eyes of the financial markets, Acorn was no longer a computer manufacturer. It was merely a holding company for highly valuable ARM shares. Burdened by a loss-making hardware division, investors demanded that the value be unlocked. Corporate consolidation was inevitable. In September 1998, the fatal blow was struck. Acorn executives stood before their staff and announced that the Phoebe project was canceled, just weeks before it was due to ship. The thousands of bright yellow plastic cases that had already been manufactured were abruptly abandoned, eventually sold off to collectors or scrapped. The hardware division, the core of what had once made Acorn the pride of British technology, was shut down entirely. The breakup of the empire was swift and clinical. In 1999, the investment bank Morgan Stanley Dean Witter bought the remains of Acorn Computers solely to strip out and distribute the ARM shares to investors. The Acorn brand and its set-top box division were sold to Pace Microtechnology. The proprietary RISC OS software was licensed out to a small company called Castle Technology, kept alive only for the most dedicated enthusiasts. The company that had taught Britain to code was erased from the corporate registry. What followed was the physical dismantling of a British digital habit. The local education authorities began sweeping the last Acorn machines out of school storage cupboards, replacing them with generic Windows laptops. The specific clatter of the Acorn mechanical keyboard faded from the staff room. The magazines disappeared from the W.H. Smith shelves. The desktop empire had fallen. The Phoebe was canceled. The yellow cases were scrapped. The assembly lines stopped. The school contracts vanished. The magazines folded. The computer division closed. The company was broken apart. The logo became a memory. The processor escaped the machine. The name Acorn Computers was formally scrubbed from the corporate registry in 1999, but its death was not the end of the story. It was merely a transformation. The company split into two entirely separate legacies, one physical and fiercely protected, the other invisible and globally dominant. The physical legacy is kept alive by a dedicated British preservation community. Today, at institutions like the National Museum of Computing at Bletchley Park and the Center for Computing History in Cambridge, the machines are not just static displays. Rows of heavy beige BBC Micros and sleek Acorn Archimedes desktop units are carefully maintained by former engineers, retired teachers, and enthusiast collectors. On vintage computer forums and in emulator communities, groups that build software allowing modern PCs to mimic old hardware instructions so that classic programs can still run, the Acorn platform refuses to disappear. A small, incredibly dedicated group of developers even continues to update and maintain RISC OS, the graphical operating system that once made the Archimedes feel like the future, keeping it functional for modern hobbyist circuit boards. But we must be careful not to view these surviving machines through the soft, inaccurate lens of mere nostalgia. When a collector rescues an Acorn Archimedes from an e-waste bin or a car boot sale, they are not just saving a piece of old plastic to play Zark one last time. They are preserving a physical argument. That heavy beige box proves that there was a time when Britain did not merely consume global technology, it built the entire stack. Acorn designed the motherboard, wrote the operating system, built the graphical interface, fostered the local software ecosystem, and engineered the silicon brain. An Acorn computer sitting in a museum case is a reminder of a vanished era of public service computing. It represents a time when a machine was built specifically for the school computer room, a trusted shared educational space, rather than designed to lock a single consumer into a global, subscription-based app store. It was a tool built to teach a generation how to control the machine, before the global market decided that the machine should control the user. Yet the ultimate legacy of Acorn Computers is not found in a museum case. It is the invisible legacy, and it is found in almost every pocket on Earth. Advanced RISC Machines, the small joint venture spun out of Acorn in a Cambridgeshire barn to build the ARM processor, grew into a global titan. Because the original Acorn engineers had accidentally designed a chip that ran cold and required incredibly little power, ARM became the absolute standard for mobile computing. When smartphones arrived, they did not run on the power-hungry Intel chips that had conquered the desktop market. They ran on ARM. Today, ARM architectures, the direct descendant of the exact instruction set designed by Sophie Wilson and Steve Ferber to save a British classroom computer, power billions of mobile phones, tablets, smart televisions, and modern laptops globally. There is also a profound, almost poetic footnote to this story. Years after Acorn collapsed, a group of Cambridge engineers and academics grew worried that British pupils were no longer learning how to code. They felt the country had lost the ambitious spirit of the BBC Micro, replacing it with passive consumption. In response, they designed a tiny, incredibly cheap bare-board computer to put programming back into the hands of children. They called it the Raspberry Pi. It became a global phenomenon, finding its way into millions of British homes, ICT rooms, and enthusiast workshops. And the processor chosen to power the Raspberry Pi, the brain driving this new educational revolution, was an ARM chip. Decades later, the ghost of Acorn Computers had quietly found its way back into the British classroom. The story of Acorn is the ultimate paradox of British technology. They lost the hardware war. They lost the school desktop to the standard PC. They lost the high street. They lost the operating system battle to Microsoft. And they lost the manufacturing scale to America and Asia. The physical machines they built were crushed by global forces they could not control. Britain did not stop inventing. It simply lost the system that turned that invention into a self-sustaining physical product. But in losing the desktop, Acorn accidentally won the world. They built a failure so brilliantly engineered that its core survived the death of its host. Somewhere in a British loft, a BBC Micro still rests beneath a protective layer of dust, its heavy mechanical keys silent, waiting for a cassette tape that once made a bedroom feel connected to tomorrow. But the true legacy of that machine is not in the loft. It is the smartphone in your hand, quietly executing instructions on an architecture born in Cambridge, long after the brand that built it faded away. See you in the next one.